Today we will be touring the library of Dr. Anthony P. Weiss, MD, an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a faculty member of the Harvard Medical School Center of Bioethics. He's a double board certified psychiatrist and neuropsychiatrist who has spent more than 13 years in senior executive and C-suite leadership roles in Greater Boston academic medicine. Dr. Weiss has authored more than 70 peer-reviewed publications, reviewed for more than 25 scientific journals, and currently serves as deputy editor of the Joint Commission Journal on Quality and Patient Safety. Dr. Weiss trained in the Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital system and holds a Master's of Medical Science from Harvard Medical School and an MBA from Babson College's F.W. Olin Graduate School of Business. Earlier in his career, Dr. Weiss trained, practiced, and conducted translational neuroimaging research at Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School's original and largest teaching hospital, and home to the largest hospital-based research program in the United States. At Mass General, he completed psychiatric residency and consultation psychiatry fellowship training, practiced neuropsychiatry, directed quality management for the Department of Psychiatry, and served as physician co-chair of the hospital-wide Clinical Policy and Records Committee. Until January of this year, Dr. Weiss served for nearly 8 years as Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center's inaugural chief medical officer, the hospital's senior physician executive. BIDMC is one of Harvard Medical School's principal teaching hospitals. It ranks third nationally among independent hospitals in National Institutes of Health funding and supports more than 250 Harvard Medical School faculty principal investigators, more than 2,500 active sponsored research projects, and more than $300 million in annual research funding. As CMO, Dr. Weiss jointly reported directly to the president of BIDMC and to the president and CEO of Harvard Medical Faculty Physicians, giving him responsibility for clinical quality, patient safety, interdisciplinary collaboration, credentialing, and clinical program development. For today's tour, Dr. Weiss has selected more than a dozen books from his collection to answer one question. Over more than 2 millennia, how have human beings tried to understand, heal, discipline, expand, and sometimes control the mind? We begin with spiritual healing, possession, exorcism, and older religious accounts of mental disturbance, then move through phrenology, hallucination, psychiatric autobiography, psychosurgery, and electrical brain stimulation. From there, the conversation turns to hypnosis, occultism, theology, philosophy, cybernetics, systems theory, and other ways of seeing the mind as an information processor. Along the way, we spend time with books on Buddhist mind training, Daniel Paul Schreiber's psychiatric memoir, Sybil and the cultural history of dissociative identity, hallucinations, dreams, and altered states, the literary attempt to represent fragmented consciousness, the rise and fall of lobotomies, Jose Delgado's controversial experiments in brain stimulation and behavioral control, and Thomas Saz's anti-psychiatry writings. We also examine the Cold War history of government-supported research into altered states, hypnosis, dissociation, and behavioral control, including the infamous MKUltra project, and ask how these earlier efforts relate to present-day debates over psychedelics, neural implants, artificial intelligence, and the technological governance of the mind. Dr. Weiss and I plan to do additional tours like this on different facets of his library. Please let us know down in the comments any questions you may have and what subjects you'd like us to cover in more depth in future tours. Before we get started with the tour, a quick note that there's some bonus resources that go along with this bookshelf tour in the first link in the description. You can download all the high-resolution photos of Dr. Weiss's library. Plus, you'll get my Classics Resources spreadsheet, which collects in one place all the key details for the major facing page translation book sets like the Loeb Classical Library. You'll also get a free book where I gathered all the best advice about how to manage your library and how to improve your reading from the 55 plus hours of bookshelf tours I've conducted over the past couple of years. Just click the first link in the description to get all of these free bonuses. Also, if you'd like to do a bookshelf tour with me, please email timothy@timothykenny.com. Lastly, a big thank you to all of my students for your continued support that makes these long-form bookshelf tours possible. There's one program and one course that I teach that may interest you and are most relevant to the subjects we cover in this tour. The first item is the Renaissance program, my guide to building an encyclopedic mind through the classics, the great books, and the best of modern knowledge. We live in a world that rewards specialization, so it can feel almost impossible to recover the kind of broad, well-rounded education earlier eras took for granted. This program gives you a lifelong framework for organizing your learning across history, geography, ideas, facts, literature, human nature, society, and the transcendent, so you can understand the major branches of knowledge, see how they fit together, and develop unique creative insights that are only possible with this kind of broad base of learning. Please click the second link in the description to learn more about the Renaissance program. The second item is my self-directed learner course, which will help you build all the skills required to pursue lifelong education through all the key steps, like learning project organization, skill investing, research, reading and annotating, note-taking, memorizing, and putting your learning into action directly or through a program of deliberate practice. Please click the third link in the description for more on the self-directed learner course. If you'd like to learn more about my other courses, programs, and learning tracks, and how you can support the production of these bookshelf tours, please click the fourth link in the description where you can view my complete course catalog. And now, let's get into the bookshelf tour with Dr. Anthony Weiss. All right, so Anthony, thanks a lot for agreeing to share your library with us today. And I'd like to start out by just asking you a bit about your background, and then we can get into how you've built and how you've organized your library here.
Yeah, of course. See, first, thank you for having me on. And I just want to, part of the reason I came on is to thank you for hosting these videos because I think you're doing something very, very important right now. This idea of the library and the book as being important as a storehouse of understanding and knowledge and I learn every time I watch one of your videos, so I'm hopeful that by sharing my library, folks can learn a little bit about some of the areas that I'm interested in as well. So thank you. Uh, Again, my name is Anthony Weiss. I'm a neuropsychiatrist, a behavioral neurologist at Harvard here in Boston, and most of my academic work is focused on understanding the mind, trying to help people, and trying to understand how the mind can have difficulties, and then how, in a modern era, we can interact with technology. And so, some of the work that I'm doing now is involved with looking at things like AI chatbots or using AI or technology to try to help with informed consent or with other procedures in modern medicine. And what I'm seeing right now in that work is that technology is something of almost like a pharmakon. And we'll talk about that at some other point, but it's this idea that it's both a cure and a poison, going back to Plato. Um, Historically, my book collection was a separate thing, and I had interest in books. I've had an interest in books all my life. Um, but over time, I've found that it's actually being more and more integrated with my academic work, and I think that's important. If you're able to try finding ways to unify your work life and your collection, that's a blessing for me. Um, the other thing I'll mention is that I used to think about my book collection is kind of separate. I had my fiction collection, I had my nonfiction collection, I had my record collection. And over time now, again, I'm trying to better integrate those. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to do as a collector. And I'll share a little bit about all that with you today.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds good. And we did a call before this. We talked about sort of what we might cover today and the concept of the different ways of intervention on the mind over the centuries, over the millennia, has fascinated both of us. And so we had a really interesting conversation about that previously. And now we're sort of, you've brought together a number of books from your collection to sort of tell the history of those different approaches to interventions over the centuries. And maybe we could now get started with the first book that you've selected.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And I think one of the things we talked about was rather than going, shelf by shelf, book by book, which I personally love again, and I'm someone who's one of the viewers who's watching all 10 hours of some of your videos. I thought we would just take some selected books. But one of the things that I think is so valuable about seeing a collection as a whole is the way in which the books talk to each other, and you hear that from different collectors or different people. But I've really found that to be true, and so you start to see, oh, this author was riffing off of that one, or this person was influenced by so and so, or that sounds very similar to what someone else was doing. And over time, you start to see the connections. So I guess I risk going to a greatest hits model, losing some of that flow. Nevertheless, we'll try to see if we can replicate that with just a few items here. I thought I would start with this book. This is old. And it's falling apart, sadly. But this is a Christian book from the 19th century. It's Catholic Gems or Treasures of the Church. I think I don't know, it's probably late 1800s. But I bring it out because it has this incredible image, which is going to be hard to show. But it's of Gustave Doré. Let me get it over there.
Very famous for his etchings, engraving.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe what I'll do, Timothy, is take a photo of that, and you can show this in close up. This is Christ healing a lunatic. So, of course, lunacy, the lunatic now is a term that we use for people who have insanity. I guess a modern word could be schizophrenia, but it had nebulous meaning then, and to some degree, people who are suffering from epilepsy, people who are suffering from all types of conditions that are intermittent and affect the mind and brain were kind of part of the mystery of the world that Jesus was walking amongst. And this image always fascinated me. In part, it's an extraordinary image. Gustave Doré, as you mentioned, is an incredible artist. And as you start collecting books from the 19th century, you'll see his, I guess, lithographs showing up across many different books. But this one also intrigued me because whatever happened to that? Here you see, Jesus and the disciples healing people with mental illness, healing people with neurological illness, looking at people with these conditions as being, I guess, spiritually possessed or in need of spiritual aid. And now we are looking at using Neuralink, to try to intervene on the brain. How did we get from this to Neuralink? And so that ultimately is the focus of my collection. Now, this concept hasn't gone away, and there are a number of other books. Let me show a couple here.
I don't know if
This
this is going to
idea
come up in
of
any of your books, but just in very ancient times, they would sometimes drill a hole in somebody's head to like let out the pressure.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And that's trephination, or trepanation. And I have a few pamphlets on trepanation here. But you're absolutely right. That was the first, I guess, form of neurosurgery. This idea that, there was too much pressure or we had to let out bad humors. I think it was from a humoral kind of Hippocratic model of the brain, different types of humors or the black bile, that sort of thing. But yeah, absolutely, that was the first neurosurgery, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the more modern neurosurgical approaches in a moment. But this idea of possession is still kind of amongst us. This is Oesterreich, T.K. Oesterreich, Possession, Demoniacal, and Other Among Primitive Races in Antiquity, the Middle Ages, and Modern Times. So this book, let me see here, I think was 1920s? 1966. Yeah, 1966. Oesterreich, it says he was born in 1880. And so I think this translation is later. I'll see if we can find when the original was written. But nevertheless, what he does in this book is look at different forms of mental distress and how over time it's been considered. And so it's a really good book to look at, where things evolved after biblical times and where we are today. And he does touch on in this book exorcism as the kind of I guess, of the spiritual approach or treatment. That's, I guess, the spiritual equivalent of trephination in this book. But there's better books for that.
I looked up the dates or the years for that. So it's 1921 was the original German, and then 1930 it was translated into English for the first time.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks, Timothy. Yeah. Yeah, so this version is 66. This is the version I have. This is from a library of ancient and modern classics. This is University Books, Secaucus, New Jersey. Yeah, it's just interesting. The other thing that I found fascinating, which is why I love the physical book as object, is I find a lot of value in looking at the covers and the early pages, right? The copyright pages, the title page, the prefaces. Don't sleep on those things, because that's where you see the genesis of a lot of the work. So I'm looking at, well, what else was in a library of ancient and modern classics from University Books? It's actually quite interesting. So we have the I Ching, the Book of Changes. We have the Holy Kabbalah from Judaism. And then you get into work by the Gnostics, Greek folklore. The Future is Now, The Significance of Precognition. So that's Arthur Osborne. So you're starting to see, and this is again some of the meat and themes that are on the shelves behind me, this linkage or relationship between formal religion and then what's replaced religion in the absence of religion.
I pulled something up on the history of this, just reading from AI. University Books was a serious reprint house for esoterica, parapsychology, occult scholarship, but it wasn't an academic press. So founded by Felix Morrow, became important because it reissued books that were hard to find, including works on magic, demonology, spiritualism, mysticism, and comparative religion.
Fantastic. Yeah, in fact, a book of ceremonial magic by Arthur Edward Waite is in here. Maybe if I have a moment, maybe later I'll show you a book I have that would belong to Arthur Edward Waite, which I'm thrilled to have. But again, this linkage between the occult, tarot, religion, the brain and mind, that's the nuts and bolts of what I'm collecting. So this is a really important one in that context. We were talking about exorcism. There's a couple of books here I just pulled out. This one, Exorcism Through the Ages. This is by Saint Elmo Nauman. This is I think this is kind of more official church material. This is published by Philosophical Library. Nauman, says he was at Christopher Newport College. Essentially, so he may not have been a religious. He may have been an academic. Um, but the way in which it's framed in here certainly is honest and I think consistent with the views of the church. And it's a really good historical overview. It's kind of a greatest hits of exorcism, I guess I'd frame it that way. Um, and so you have in here the Devils of Laudun. That's probably one of the most famous ones. But there are a number of others. And the Legend of the Golem. Some of your watchers may be familiar with that. So there's a lot of really interesting material in here.
Do
And
these
again,
two
this
books
is it.
generally cover outside the West much, or is it mostly within the Western tradition?
This is mostly in the Western tradition, and I don't know in here. And actually, it's an excellent question. I don't know the history or belief in um, actual intervention in spiritual possession in other areas. There is a book. I didn't bring it out, which is more of an anthropologic book looking at possession from an kind of an anthropologic standpoint, looking at communities in South America, in the Caribbean. And so there's views, in a number of those communities. Um, but whether in the East, there's something akin to that is something I'm gonna have to look up. I'm gonna take a look and try to see if I can understand that.
I think in South America, especially, there's been interaction with that in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has an approach. I'm blanking on what it's called, but a sort of the way it interacts with different cultures and makes accommodations to an extent with those cultures and language and stuff like that, traditions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In the way in which, yeah, different cultures or different native kind of belief systems kind of meld with Catholicism or with Christianity, and then the way in which those meldings then persist with some admixture of the two. I think that's fascinating. A couple of other books just on exorcism. While I pulled a few. This is interesting. This is Richard Deutsch. Exorcism, um, Possession or Obsession. And now this is modern, and here's a nice picture of Deutsch on the back. I don't know much about him, but I think he was more on the occult side. I think he comes at this not as a religious. Again, he's not a priest doing exorcisms, but rather someone fascinated by them, and I think having some familiarity with them from he may have been a pagan witch, but don't quote me on that. I don't know if you have any information on him through AI, and you can see there's a actual pentagram. It's hard to see on the cover. It's very faint on the cover. But this one's a little bit more sensationalistic. But this one came out again early 70s when there was a lot of interest in exorcism from film, right? So it was right around that time that people started to get more interested again in that.
And a number of the books we've looked at, you have them in plastic. So that means they're generally first editions, or maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I tend to do that. I tend to do that just in general. When I get a book, I'll carefully clean it, and then I'll put it in these Mylar sleeves, just to protect it. Some of these are, yeah. I mean, most of these. Then you saw, for example, with the Oesterreich. That's not necessarily a valuable book. This is not a These aren't valuable books, but I thought I would just protect them. I tend to be someone who, if something is in my possession, I feel like I'm a steward of it for a period of time and try to keep it protected as best as I can. I tended historically not to write in my books at all. I tended
Well,
to be one of those people who's like, no, no, no. But as my academic work it melds more and more with my interest in collecting, I actually have a whole nother set of books. You may have shown some of the photos at my working library, at my office at the hospital. And those are books that I'll tend to write in. And now I've got a general rule. If it's a paperback, then I can actually use pen. If it's a hardback, I'll tend to use pencil. But for some of these, especially the rarer books, I would never write in them.
mhm. Okay.
I found this yesterday at my favorite used bookstore, which I don't know if I should mention where it is or not, and give away my sources. But I thought I would just show this just because I actually picked it up yesterday. This is just a little pamphlet. This is Begone Satan, a true account of a 23-day exorcism in Erling, Iowa in 1928 by Father Carl Vogel. Um, and uh, and this is there's the priest that did the exorcism in the back.
So you were just browsing and you saw that?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I happened to see this one. I thought, oh, I can't pass on that.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Um, No, to get I guess maybe a little bit more serious. Not that exorcism isn't serious. I mean that is actually a legitimate approach, still pursued by the Catholic Church certainly. But this question of what happened to spiritual healing, it certainly is not part of standard fare in medical school. Just to be clear, I'd say that for most physicians, there is an interest in understanding the spiritual life of the patient, understanding what resources they have, seeing if it's a support to them, and so forth. But we're not necessarily taught in those modes of approach by any stretch. This set is really interesting, and this is let me see if I can hold it up. This is Jean-Claude Larchet, Therapy of Spiritual Illnesses. And again, um, I should say from the outset, we probably should have said this at the beginning. I'm not here to provide specific medical advice. Um, so I'm not recommending, and nor does Larchet recommend that, well, just pick this up and you're going to be able to heal yourself. This is not a self-help book. As you can tell, it's a very serious 3-volume set. But I have this and I've read through this because it's one of the only modern kind of takes on treating, I guess, what we might call mental illness seriously as a spiritual illness. And he's Eastern Orthodox, and he does a wonderful job of laying it out and how he views sin and virtue as being kind of fl- different sides of a coin, and the approaches to how sin can affect one's mind, and how through virtuous practices and prayer and spiritual guidance, one can overcome that. So, I find it really interesting. He is still alive, Jean-Claude Larchet, but I think he's probably getting somewhat on in years. And he's written other books as well. But this 3-volume set, this is a really nice set for anyone who might be interested in these general topics. This one, again, from an Eastern Orthodox Christianity perspective, but again, I think very applicable to anyone thinking about these concepts from I guess from a Christian standpoint.
I'm reading here that it was originally published in French in 1991 and then English in 1997.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, he speaks French, and I think most of his work was French. This is published by Alexander Press, which is out of Quebec in Canada. And the translation here is by Father Kilian Sprecher. It's translated, and I've not read him in French. I don't read fluent French, so I don't know how good the translation is, but I think he's approved of this. And then I thought I would just show, you mentioned Eastern traditions, and I think it's obviously critical in my collection. I've started to develop this a bit more, um, not just focusing on Christianity or Kabbalah or Judaism, but rather looking at different approaches. And this is a very good book. This is Mind Training, the Great Collection. This is translated by Thupten Jinpa. This is essentially Tibetan Buddhism, and again a little bit, I would say, of the greatest hits, but it's the greatest hits in depth over 1,000 plus years. Um, so the earliest writing in here comes from 982. Um, and it talks about Mahayana mind training and the 7-point mind training, a number of really, really important concepts coming out of Buddhism. Um, Hinduism, certainly even prior to Buddhism, has a very thoughtful and well-constructed model of the mind and the way it can get disturbed. I'm not that familiar with it. I am a bit more familiar with Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, and I found this to be particularly solid. Once again, this is not NOT, a self-help, pick this up and you're gonna be able to figure out how you use a little bit of meditation and treat your own mind. But for anyone interested in, what the Buddhist writings have to say, and what some of the great texts in Buddhism have to say, this is a good one to pick up.
There's also an interesting phenomenon, which I haven't been able to look in a huge amount of depth, but people identifying as Christian Buddhists or Buddhist Christians, both in academia and elsewhere. Bell hooks is maybe a famous example of that, but there's some others. So, yeah, it's kind of, there's something interesting there.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And I think it's not just those two religious faiths. It's like William James, for example, and the existentialists, Emerson, for example, Thoreau. They started to see, Emerson's a great example because he was a minister. He was a Unitarian minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, deeply religious. I have a set of his sermons, four-volume set of his sermons. And for me here, in the Boston area, a very important writer. But over time, he became more familiar with works that were just starting to be translated into English coming over from the East, right? And so he started to become more familiar with some of these, I think, Hindu and Buddhist models, as well as perhaps models coming out of China, and started to incorporate them. And then you see William James, the great American psychologist, at the end of the 19th century, thinking about the varieties of religious perspective and how those relate to the mind. So, not a new phenomenon at all, to pull from or think about the way in which these different faith traditions kind of tell us about the mind. It's again, what our minds are trying to do, and this is probably my academic work. Our brains and minds are trying to make sense of the world. The world is infinitely complex, and we have our brains are, to some degree, there's only so much energy that our brain can use. So we have a finite brain and mind trying to understand an infinitely complex world. And so developing models, frames, is one way in which we're then able to use that, to kind of simplify the world. And we need to simplify the world because it's so complicated and so chaotic and so dangerous that to have a mental model that you can kind of go out into the world with, is actually useful. And so religion certainly is one of those mental models, and different mental models, I think not surprisingly, have come up onto similar themes of what is reality and how do we think about ourselves as humans in that space. Um, and obviously there's critical differences as well. I thought I would maybe show a couple of other books. We were talking about possession. Um, this one, this one is kind of interesting. This is Sybil. So this is written by Flora, Rheta, Schreiber. I think Schreiber was the psychiatrist, um, and Sybil was the patient. And Sybil, I don't recall her actual name. Her actual name is known, and I don't think it's a secret anymore. Um, but she had 16 personalities.
I have the name here, Shirley Ardell Mason.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. Yeah. And so this is essentially and she uses her she has a little family tree in here where she's using I think a fictitious name. Um which is interesting because this book, which is billed as nonfiction, published 1973, so almost the same year as that book about exorcism, um, was billed as nonfiction. Over time, I think most people would say, yeah, some of this is probably true. Some of this is probably a little bit um, a narrative for the purposes of creating kind of an interesting book. But it had huge impact. The idea of split personality, the idea of dissociative identity disorder, all started, or much of it started here, at least the modern story with this particular book, Sybil. And it's interesting because, again, as you think about possession, what they'll describe in some of the earlier things I showed is this idea that you're one person at one point, and then you can be another person, and what's happening there in terms of the demons or the spirits coming into you. Very different mode of thinking about it versus this is the manifestation of severe trauma, which then fragments the mind in a way that psychotherapy can help to put back together. And that, I think that's kind of the connection there between some of the earlier things I showed and this book.
I was just doing a bookshelf tour with a medievalist yesterday, and one of his books he mentioned was Memoirs of My Nervous Illness by Daniel Paul Schreber. Highly successful German jurist who eventually became president of a high court in Saxony, and in middle age, he experienced what would now likely be called psychosis. He kept unlike many psychiatric patients, he was highly educated, wrote a remarkably detailed account of his experience, and was taken up by various psychoanalysts and Lacan as well. So it's sort of a classic in that genre. Oh, nice.
Yeah, this is it. This is the English translation of it. Um, and you're spot on to bring this one up. This is an important book, not only because Freud commented on this, but also until this book, and there's a couple of other ones that I have on the shelf here. The idea was of someone actually recovering from a mental illness and then writing a book about it was unheard of, right? And that's what's really important about this is it showed that um, some of these things that we call mental illness or even schizophrenia, because he probably would have been diagnosed as having schizophrenia now, are conditions that people can actually make great strides in improving, can write books about. This is an English translation. The translation is important. It's written by Ida McAlpine, translated by Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter. The interesting thing there is that was a mother and son combo, and they were historians of psychiatry. And so they published a number of critical books into translation. And yeah, this was first published in Leipzig. I think you may have mentioned it, Timothy, 1903. And this translation is this is from 1955. Dawson and Sons. So yeah, excellent book. I'll show you another one since we're on this. Sorry, I'm going to get up and move around. But this is a really important one, just in that same genre. This is Clifford Beers, A Mind That Found Itself. Same kind of genre. I mean, very different stories. But ultimately very similar in that this is the autobiography of someone who, again, probably would have been diagnosed as having maybe a severe mental illness, schizophrenia, who then came to write about what their experience was like and how they recovered. Beers, interestingly, went on, and I have another book actually signed by him, to be more of what we might call now a patient advocate. And so he started some patient advocacy groups for mental illness. And ultimately, that's going to be very important because those groups, I guess the modern version of that might be something like NAMI, NAMI, or DBSA, or OCD Foundation. They're very common now. Were obviously not around in the early part of the 19th century, but by the end of the 20th century, they had extraordinary influence on moving the field past some abuses and some issues that we might talk about. But those are great books. I'm glad you mentioned Schreiber's book.
And funny enough, and I may have told you this on our previous call, but I actually have two different bookshelf tour guests who both have had experiences with mental illness. One of them with schizophrenia, another with borderline, and they both shared their collections and talked. Especially the guy who experienced schizophrenia, he shared his experience of he took marijuana, I think, for the first time, and that is what caused it. And then he tells us about a particular book that sort of reactivates him or brings him back. And so it's interesting getting into sort of how conscious, how reading itself can sort of potentially trigger things or change our consciousness. And those are special books when you have that experience where it really takes you somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because what are you doing? I mentioned the Pharmakon, earlier. So when you go back to Plato and the Phaedrus, the Pharmakon was talking about writing, and in the Pharmakon and Phaedrus, it's Socrates. I mean, that story itself is fascinating because it's Plato talking about Socrates telling a story about King Themis, who may or may not have been a real Egyptian god king, right? So you've got layers and layers of fiction and narrative, and like, did Socrates really tell this story? Was there really a King Themis? But at any rate, King Themis is presented by I think one of the other god kings, or maybe one of his subjects. You might know the story better than I do, Timothy. To about a bunch of innovations, and one of them was writing. And Themis says, "What you've found here is not." I'm going to misquote, but it's a pharmakon, meaning it is both a cure and a poison, both cure and a poison. And so what he was saying is that, and what Socrates, and then I guess ultimately Plato, believed, is that by writing things down, like in a book, you can preserve it, you can share it, so I can read what Schreiber was experiencing. But you're not really mentally engaging with the material in the same way, because you have to remember that before writing, you had literally had to memorize everything that you wanted to say, and you had to memorize. And so Plato and I guess Socrates felt like this was going to lead to some breakdown in our ability to actually use our brains. If the more you're on mental models, the more you're relying on the written word, the less you're relying on your own innate mental skill. And I think we're seeing that now today as we think about de-skilling using ChatGPT or AI or, all of those tools. How much of our brain are we actually offloading to technology? And that's, it's a blessing and a curse, I guess. It's a pharmakon.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. The written word can be extremely potent, both as a therapy and probably also has been used in history for ill purposes, whether that's propaganda or spreading negative messages and so forth. And I'm sure in your library tours you've seen examples of all of that.
I mean, there is such a thing as, I've seen the term bibliotherapy. It's not maybe in the medical textbooks, but it is. And you also have journaling, which is sort of writing. So both the taking in of words and the producing of words. I think it was President Lincoln who would sometimes write a letter and then toss it in the trash or
Interesting.
something like that. So there is something there.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Where to go from here? Let's talk a little bit about, we've been talking about kind of spiritual perspectives. Let me get us into the brain. So when did we move then from thinking that mental illness was maybe a result of sin or possession of some sort to something that was more of a brain disorder? The exact date isn't known. It probably flows from the 17th century, but in the 19th century is when major strides were made, and those came in two forms. The first is in phrenology. So this is 1874, which is a little bit late in phrenology terms, but it's a kind of a cool image. And so phrenology was I guess I'll call it a science at the time, which thought that different cognitive abilities, different mental abilities had different locations where in the brain. And those included things like emotions or the ability to understand other people or to remember things. And Gall and Spurzheim are probably the people most felt to be the kind of introducers of phrenology. But then it took on a life of its own, and many people started to practice it. It became something of a quack science, I guess I'll call it. And ultimately, it was disproven in the sense that they thought that if you could feel the skull, you would see areas of the skull that have been kind of overdeveloped because that particular area has been highly used. So if you look carefully on this, you've got things like cautiousness. So cautiousness is going to be kind of like right here in the parietal lobe, or something like that. So you could just feel my cautiousness bump there, and you'd be able to diagnose me as being a very cautious person. Well, that turned out to be not really at all true. But the idea that A, these functions, these mental functions are in the brain, and B, that they might be localized actually became very important. And there are other writers. Let me just show you one book. This one's very important. This is Briere de Boismont on hallucinations. I mentioned that I had a book that was owned by Arthur Edward Waite. This is it. So this is fascinating because de Boismont was a French I think he was a neurologist who was writing about where hallucinations lived. And he did not treat hallucinations, again, what we might think of as psychosis or, abnormal kind of visions, images or voices in the head. He did not see those as being the result of demonic possession or of sin. He saw them as being a manifestation of brain disorder. And so he wrote this book. This is in a beautiful box that a friend of mine made. And you can see here, this copy was owned by A.E. Waite. Waite is known now as the inventor of the tarot, one of the modern tarot decks. So I threw in a tarot card in here. But it's fascinating that Waite was interested in this book because it probably intrigued him on the way in which our minds and brains can be disrupted, how we might see hallucinations or images, how those might manifest during sleep versus during the waking life. But this is an important book, even if it wasn't owned by Waite, because it was one of those mid-19th century writers starting to move us toward the brain as the locus of mental pathology.
There's this concept, and I'm not really sure what you would call it, but that some of these non-normal states are sort of a fuller experience of the mind, and a normal state is sort of especially the frontal lobe, but like a function of sort of tamping down that fullness into something that's maybe more pragmatically useful for going about our day-to-day things. And maybe that fuller kind of experience is connected to hallucinations or do you have any thoughts on that concept?
Yeah, I mean, that's partly, like the triune brain. Pull this one. This is Paul MacLean, a triune concept of the brain and behavior. So MacLean was a neurologist, psychiatrist, probably mid 20th century, who thought he actually coined the term the limbic system, the emotional circuits of the brain. But what he thought was that we had a reptilian brain, and then there was a second brain, and then there was a third brain. And the third brain would have been probably more linked to what you're describing, this kind of frontal lobe kind of brain.
Putting
And
the
it's
brakes almost on the
100%, yeah. Now, one approach is, why is it that humans have mental illness? Why do humans hallucinate? Why do humans have OCD? Why do humans have such angst about their lives? And my pet rabbit doesn't seem to, or the reptiles don't seem to. And part of that relates to what you were saying, Timothy, is that it's probably it's probably a pharmakon, that we have this extended mind that is capable of imagining, it's capable of, Michael Levin, a biologist here in the Boston area, has an amazing YouTube channel that some of your viewers may want to watch, but he has a concept called the cognitive light cone. It's this idea that we can extend our minds out in time and space so that I can think about, well, what's it going to be like next week, Tuesday? But with that comes some difficulties, because partly those are long fibers that extend into the brain and they're prone to being disrupted. And partly because in my thinking about the future, I'm moving away from a very solid script. And as you're moving away from the solid script or rote kind of patterns, see a bug, eat the bug, the reptile does. Now you're going to potentially get into some trouble.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a very loosey-goosey way of describing what I think you're getting at. But I would probably point people to folks like Paul MacLean and the triune brain concept.
I guess I think that's more of the sort of motivational side of things where it's like short versus long term, whereas I'm getting at the sort of both experiences that people would have with hallucinations or break from reality, but also drug-induced experiences. And I think that's sort of what's interesting about this other bookshelf tour guy I was telling you about, is that like there's books you can read that, and even movies that will sort of try to give you the experience of schizophrenia, for example, and they are very you have to be sort of in the right state of mind to sit down and watch something like that. But it is, can be very disconcerting and sort of disorienting. And there's also books that try to capture that experience. And that's part of some more modern or even postmodern experimental fiction, or just writing, where they try to capture the fragmentation and disorientation of first person experience and consciousness. So I think that that's more what I was trying to get at, but I think I mean, they're interconnected. So, and I think even with Freud and his sort of dream, because while you were talking about, when you brought up Freud, I should have mentioned that, he had the he had the self-analysis, because I thought I'd remembered he had analyzed himself, but I forget how he did it, whether it was journaling or something else, but he did write down his dreams. And I think dreams are a good example that everyone can relate to, just in terms of it's not necessarily a continuous experience. Your mind and your experience can be in a bunch of different places. So I was more getting at those types of experience. And Arrowhead is a famous website where people capture experiences on different things. So that's more what I was trying to get at. But the emotions, obviously, and motivation factor into that also.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways we could go off of that, and I think you're mentioning an important one. This is maybe one of the books that your other
Agreed.
um, um, library tour
Guest, yeah, bookshelf tour
might
guest.
might have mentioned. Yeah, this is Hallucinations, a Behavior, Experience, and Theory, edited by Siegel and Louis Jolion West, who I'll mention in a second. But in here are some pretty trippy pictures. Let me see if I can bring them up. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of images in here about what it might be like to experience hallucinations. Um,
And, Duray, that's one of the things that I always thought was fascinating about his artwork, is it does have that trippy
yeah,
feel to it.
yeah. Yeah, so this book was written in 1975, and I'll just mention it kind of as an aside. I think, again, we'll have to double check this, but I think Louis Jolion West was connected to the MK Ultra work. As some of your viewers may be familiar with MK Ultra experiments and the ways in which the CIA and the government induced psychosis in a number of people, citizens, and I think West was an advisor to some of that. I don't want to disparage him inappropriately, but I think that's known fact now.
Yeah,
Um,
I can read a little bit from the
yeah,
AI here. West was connected to MK Ultra. The documented version is that he was a psychiatrist and hypnosis/LSD researcher who received CIA-connected funding under the MK Ultra subproject 43, involving hypnosis, suggestibility, dissociation, and drugs. The broader MK Ultra program ran from 1953 into the 1970s and involved CIA behavioral modification research, including LSD experiments, often with serious ethical violations.
yeah, yeah. It's a fascinating and disturbing, again, part of our history, and that's part again of the Pharmakon. So, um, the use of substances like, oh, well, now you're seeing actually a rebirth of interest in psychedelic therapy, like using psychedelics to try to treat folks who have, let's say, profound and serious PTSD, And again, some patients and some of the research now coming out of that suggests that it's actually quite powerfully beneficial. But obviously, it can also have extraordinarily detrimental consequences. As the guest you had on who experienced schizophrenia as triggered by marijuana, or the way in which LSD or acid or other substances can cause more permanent problems in thinking. I mean, it's an excellent example of that. So yeah, the early 70s again, some strong interest in the ways in which our mind can be expanded, but also then, what some of the implications of that might be. As we start to think then about the brain as being the focus of hallucinations, that then, of course, led to, well, maybe we could intervene in the brain to actually treat people. And you have to remember again, we're in the early 20th century now, and we did have a couple of authors. We talked about Schreiber and we talked about Clifford Beers, who kind of spontaneously recovered from their severe mental illness. Most people did not, and most people were in institutions, were completely non-functional, really had no ability to test reality, and we had zero, literally zero actual medications that were useful. And so, what do? So into that comes the idea of surgical and intervention in the brain. And here I should probably mention Freeman and Watts. So Walter Freeman and James Watts, this is psychosurgery or lobotomy. Your viewers may be more familiar with lobotomy. Um, Lobotomy, they did not really invent, I'd say, psychosurgery. It's maybe a couple of years prior to that, and the person that invented psychosurgery actually won the Nobel Prize in 1949. But they popularized it, I guess, especially Freeman. And so Freeman turned out he was a psychiatrist. He was not a neurosurgeon, and he started to become so convinced that this was beneficial that he created his own approach to lobotomy, which was, I guess, the ice pick lobotomy. And so he literally took an ice pick. I'll see if I can get some pictures of it, and started to slide it up underneath the eyelid, up, breaking through the cribriform plate, and then starting to destroy brain tissue using that approach. People were awake. Many of them might have had some mild medication to try to kind of make them a little bit more sedated. But this was his approach, and he toured the country then doing this. And let me just share. I think, yeah, he called it transorbital lobotomy. I don't know if that's going to be visible. Yeah, you can see there, that's essentially what Freeman was doing. Now, this is the second edition of the textbook. I have a copy of the first edition. This one's important because in this one, Watts actually, after the description of the transorbital approach, writes something very important. Let me see if I can actually bring it up. Because Watts was a neurosurgeon, and he was aghast at what Freeman began to do with this approach. And essentially, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it now. Hold on. Oh, here's another. It's another really famous image here.
And how is that one different than the previous one?
Yeah, this is the leucotome, but it's in that same section.
Okay.
And then here, transorbital lobotomy by James W. Watts. So he then writes that it is my opinion that any procedure involving cutting of brain tissue is a major surgical operation, no matter how quickly or atraumatically one enters the intracranial cavity. Therefore, it follows, logically, that only those who have been schooled in neurosurgical techniques can handle the complications that may arise should perform the operation. If it is a major operation, disability constitutes the indication for transorbital lobotomy. So he essentially says, I completely disagree with a psychiatrist going around using ice picks on awake people doing this procedure. Um, and wrote that in the second edition. That's why I think the second edition of the textbook is interesting and important. This is, I think, 1950, probably 1950, just to give your viewers some sense of the time. Yeah, the first edition, 1942. This edition, the second edition, 1950. Now, neurosurgical approaches to brain conditions was in its early years. So neurosurgery as a field was just getting started. And Watts was one of the early neurosurgeons. Obviously, that's had tremendously beneficial good for many, 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 many people, whether it's removing brain tumors or treating other conditions. And to some degree, there's been new interest in using these approaches for severe mental illness as well. But Freeman's kind of approach to this set the entire field back probably by decades because it was the public started to get very concerned by what they were seeing. And the results of the procedure started to be analyzed by scientists to see, oh, actually, actually, these results were not very good, or actually, there were a lot of side effects, or while some of people did actually get better, a lot did not.
Mhm. You used a phrase earlier that I thought maybe you could say a few more words about, which is you said a lot of these patients were institutionalized and they didn't have the ability to test reality. Maybe you could just explain what that means and what it looks like to test reality.
Yeah, so the term psychosis is used as kind of a bucket term, and it was actually helps to distinguish from neurosis. So we all have faulty reality testing. As I mentioned earlier, what we're trying to do is trying to see what's going on in the real world. And what we do is we compare the real world with a map that we carry around in our mind. And we compare then reality, the incoming sensory information with this map, and we try to see where is it different. And this is a process, it goes by different terms, but active inference is the concept. Carl Friston is probably the major thinker in this space. He's a current neuroscientist, psychiatrist in the UK. And the idea there is that we can do two things if there's a delta, if there's a difference between reality and our map. We can change our map so that it better reflects reality, or we can intervene in the world so that it brings it closer in line with what we think reality should be or what we think our map should be. And so, I encourage you to kind of play with that. So some people, we all have small differences. We all go through the world viewing things with biases. We have different kind of ways of thinking about ourselves that may not be 100%, based in reality. So we all have that. When it's minor, we kind of call that a neurosis, again, using very general and somewhat old terms, but and then when it's more severe, and especially when it's fixed, when it's impervious to change, we call that a psychosis. And this idea that the reality testing, the ability to modify one's mental map in the context of what's actually coming in is broken or deficient or disturbed in some ways. That would be a reasonable definition of psychosis. And there are many different causes of psychosis. Some of them might be when you're medically very ill and you're in the hospital and you've been given a lot of medications, or you have a very severe infection and you're elderly. we see psychosis all the time. People start seeing things on the walls or starting to have beliefs that are not true. The major non-medical, I guess I'll put it that way, or non-induced kind of version of psychosis we now call schizophrenia. That's the major kind of form of psychosis that is part of the DSM-5. But of course, other people, with severe depression or with mania or other conditions can also develop psychotic features to their situation.
What is it called if it is induced?
Organic psychosis, or typically the kind of people that I was describing, that would be delirium. That's another commonly used term. And again, our abilities here, this is part of almost the fundamental flaw of modern psychiatry, which is we've got these buckets, these English terms that I'm using to try to describe different states of mind, right? And they're really imperfect. There's a lot of fluidity between them, and they don't necessarily map back to genetics or brain function in the way that we would hope they would have. And so it's left us at a place where we're having a hard time kind of moving forward. So if we may need to change our nosology, the categorization of these mental states, um, and in a way try to bring them more in line with maybe something like the active inference model, because I think that's a testable model that might have implications for our understanding of actual disease states.
Mm,
But
okay.
yeah, delirium. So many of the viewers probably have had family members who were hospitalized, and they saw that, wow, what happened to my grandfather? He's seeing bugs. Like he never was crazy before. Like what's going on? It's again a state of the brain that occurs when resources to the brain are cut off, or when there's a lot of inflammation in the brain or the body, and we see this level of psychosis really emerging in those states.
Okay.
Maybe just a few other books.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, let me show you a couple of, like this one here. Yeah, so after lobotomy, and after Freeman, and after a lot of pushback, many of your viewers may have seen um, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That was again written, I think, early 60s. The movie was made in the mid 70s, but was part of that zeitgeist of, wow, what's going on here in psychiatry? What kind of things are we doing to people who have mental illness? And that led to, government investigations, a lot of public pushback, a lot of patient advocacy pushback, and a pulling back. At the same time, we had better medications to actually treat mental illness, so that was good, and so we moved forward with those, in lieu of, again, actually cutting parts of the frontal lobe off. But one parallel path that emerged out of the work of understanding the brain as the locus of mental illness was that we can both read and write the neural activity, the electrical activity coming out of the brain. So we can read the electrical activity from the brain. That's called the EEG, the electroencephalogram. And so we can attach wires to the skull and see what is going on in the brain. Like where is it active? And that led to a lot of very fascinating and important research and work. And then we could also electrically stimulate parts of the brain to see if we might be able to induce symptoms, recreate symptoms, or treat people. The first person, I mean, again, firsts are a little bit sometimes hard, but Wilder Penfield would be definitely the first major figure. He was a neurosurgeon in Montreal. I'm not going to pull out some of his books, but he started to stimulate the brain while people were undergoing neurosurgery. So their skulls were open, they were doing neurosurgery, and he would take an electrode probe and stimulate And since the patients are awake during a lot of neurosurgical procedures, your brain actually doesn't have sensation. And so they can open the skull, they can actually put something into your skull. They'll numb up the area right around there, but you're otherwise awake. And so the patient could tell Dr. Penfield what they were experiencing, and many of them were experiencing hallucinations, what we might call psychotic symptoms, but they weren't psychotic. They were there for another reason, and he was actually stimulating parts of their brain. Well, that got people thinking that maybe we could use stimulation to actually treat people. And this book, Jose Delgado's Physical Control of the Mind, is probably the most infamous and most important book in that realm. Delgado was a very serious and very thoughtful neuroscientist. He came out of a lab, and I think it was at Yale, that was doing extraordinary work. A lot of it in animal models, but then also in humans, in understanding the electrical activity of the brain and the ways in which it can cause seizures. That's another concept, epilepsy or seizures, abnormal electrical firing of the brain. But also the ways in which it normally provides us with ways of communicating across brain areas, and also ways in which it can go bad in terms of mental illness. And so Delgado got the idea of maybe if I stimulate parts of the brain electrically, that could be therapeutic, and we could maybe, instead of cutting out parts of the brain, actually stimulate parts of the brain. He then got the concept that maybe that would be a way to actually control bad behaviors like violence. And so it was his deep belief that through his work and through the work of others, he might be able to create a much more peaceful world, which is a beautiful idea. But he approached it by thinking about, well, maybe we could just take people who were violent or aggressive and start zapping their brain. And that kind of rubbed people the wrong way. This book is very important. In this book, and again, I think there's video available on YouTube. He describes what was called the stimoceiver. So not only was he doing actual surgical kind of stimulation, but he had a remote control stimulator, so that at a distance he could press a button and it would zap the brain that was implanted in their head. Now he did this in bulls, charging bulls. He was from Spain, and there's a very famous video, I think it's on YouTube, of him having implanted a stimoceiver in a charging bull, the charging bull coming at him in a bull ring, right? And he pushes it and the bull stops, right? Whether he did this actually in humans, I actually don't know. I think he did do some studies in humans with the stimoceiver. To some degree, he left the United States and continued his work outside the United States, and the trail of his scientific and clinical activities gets a little bit pulled at that point. He ended up continuing on. This book was published in, let me see if I have it here, 1969. I think he died in maybe the late 90s. But a very, very important thinker in this space. Now, this is critical. This is absolutely critical when you think about Neuralink, right? Because this is the predecessor of, having wearables that might help stimulate in the brain. We do this medically now for a number of conditions, and it's actually standard of practice now for some seizure disorders, for Parkinson's disease, and for some other conditions, including essential tremor. When they're very severe, these types of stimulators can be life-changing and beneficial. It's not had the type of benefit we would have hoped for most psychiatric illness. Still being used in some places, still beneficial, but not clearly. And once again, just as with lobotomy, pullback from the field, now all of a sudden, oh no, I don't want to touch that. And so for decades after this, not a lot of work was done in this space. I'll just show you one other book. This is, again, fiction is a useful. So this is Michael Crichton, um, Jurassic Park. You might be familiar with Jurassic Park, but here's his book, The Terminal Man. And so this is a book. When did he write this? 75, maybe. You can see here pictures of the brain on the inside. He also wrote the Andromeda Strain. Crichton, by the way, was a physician. He graduated from Harvard Medical School. I don't think he ever practiced. I don't think he ever was a practicing physician, but he was very familiar with medical terminology. This book was published in 1972, and it describes, again, you can see here, a man who has implanted electrodes in his head, and what ensues from that. And this caught the attention not only of the general public, work by Delgado and others, but obviously science fiction writers who started to think about, well, what are the implications of that? Is that something we really want? Are you sure we want to be doing that? That sort of thing. Um, yeah, I think maybe I'll stop there. I mean, there's so many other directions to go. Maybe what I'll do is just show you two record albums to close out with. Um, so as I mentioned at the outset, I used to think, oh, I've got my music collection over there, and then my book collection. But over time, my collecting instincts have been, let me create more unity and look for records or themes that fit. And I'll just show a couple. This is, again, we don't need to talk necessarily about the music. This is the Austerity Program, Bible Songs 1. I think this is probably about 5 years old or so. This is Controlled Burn recordings. Austerity Program, this is, I'd say, hard rock. I think it's a duo with an electric drum set. But it's hard, and it's very good. But what caught my attention is the Doré picture on the cover, and aggressive music. Thinking about some of the stories in the Bible, this is Old Testament. Um, can't remember the exact story, but essentially the king had this man's sons all killed in front of him, and then he had his eyes poked out, or so really interesting. But it's these stories from the Bible, and Doré's ability to capture the stories continues to capture our imagination today, and so I think this is a really good example of that. And then this one is pretty cool. This is Doppler effect. This is neurotelepathy. And we didn't talk. Maybe in a future one, if you invite me back, Timothy, we'll talk about telepathy, hypnosis. This idea that we don't necessarily need to actually put wires on the head. Maybe we can do that through other means, right? So telepathy, hypnosis, mesmerism. We didn't talk about any of that, but those are all be fair game in parts of the collection. But here you have Doppler effect, which is just one man. I think he's out of Detroit, and has been making pretty incredible. This is electronic music since the mid '90s. This is a more recent album of his. Thinking about the way in which we connect with each other. And again, just as the stories in the Bible are, stories that we still tell and think about, in terms of the way in which we interact with God and with each other, how we connect with each other, how we talk to each other, how we communicate with each other, and the mystery that is your brain, your mind, my brain, my mind, and how we kind of let each other know about it, is something that, still intriguing us today.
Well, we've got a great collection here, and we've just scratched the surface, I think, but I'm looking forward to exploring more of your books next time. And thanks a lot for sharing all this with us. Maybe you could leave us with, if you'd like maybe if you'd like to give people a book or two that they could start with, or would give them an overview or a history of some of these ideas. And then also if there's any recommendations you'd like from the audience, of maybe areas you're currently exploring that people might have book recommendations for you.
Oh man, yeah, those are two good questions. I, I mean, I have dozens and dozens of overview books, historical overview books. So it's hard, and it's hard to recommend because there's different. We touched on no less than 10 different major themes. So a book that I would strongly recommend people read. Let me just pull it.
And just while you're getting that, I just realized we didn't show the photos. So if you wanted to spend a few minutes looking at the photos, we could do that if you'd like.
Of the library itself.
Yeah, all the screen share. We could
Yeah,
get on the
sure.
screen
Yeah,
share. Okay.
yeah, we can go through those.
Okay.
Let me just share this book first. First, this is New York Review of Books, which I shout out to New York Review of Books because I absolutely love these paperbacks. And I'm sure that you've had other guests. The livery, the consistency, how they look on the shelf. I love it. Yeah. So but this book, if there was one book that I would recommend, this is fiction now. So I know you probably skew nonfiction on your channel, but this is The Continuous Catherine Mortonhoe by D.G. Compton. D.G. Compton was a fiction writer, 60s, 70s. I'm not sure when he passed, but I believe he's passed. I think he died. But this book was written in the early 70s. It went by a different name here in the United States. It went by the name called The Unsleeping Eye. And The Unsleeping Eye got made into a movie. But I'd encourage people to get this New York Review of Books original version, The Continuous Catherine Mortonhoe. And what this book is about Catherine Mortonhoe, who is dying of a neurologic condition that's a little bit mysterious. But the important thing is that everyone wants to see what it's like to be her. And so the media of that period is doing what's called reality TV. And again, this was written in, I think, 73, where they are going to track Catherine Mortonhoe 24/7 for as long as she lives. And they set a journalist out to meet with her. And the journalist has an embedded camera in his eyes. So when he sees, just as I'm seeing you now, and we're recording this, this is what the journalist had. And so he befriends Catherine Mortonhoe, and unbeknownst to her, that friendship gets transmitted up so that the entire public is seeing that interaction. And um, I'm not doing it justice because it's an extremely well-written book, but it's important because it's so prescient about the 24/7 kind of nature of media, reality TV, interventions on the brain, even the condition that she has, I think has some relevance for our current state of malaise in our world. This is what I'd recommend.
Awesome. All right, let me pull up the photos here. So this is the first photo in a wide shot. You've got the great books here.
Yeah, so I picked those up in the pandemic. I got, and this is maybe a common theme from amongst a lot of your viewers. Felt like I need to retain and make sure that I keep, and I've reorganized them by color. I don't know. I liked seeing them grouped that way. But yeah, those are just the great books. And then yeah, this is in what I call the inner sanctum. This is my home library, kind of the better books. And then behind the drawers, the doors on the bottom, there are books, more books. Oh yeah, that's a great shot. Yeah, so you can see here You can see right in the center there, actually, it says the center of the cyclone. We didn't talk about him. That's John C. Lilly. Um, and so talking about Lilly is an absolutely fascinating person. We could talk about him maybe in another program, but he looked at all the ways that you can open up your mind using drugs, but also isolation chambers, these tanks, kind of tanks where you're separated from all sensation. So he was inter- very interesting man. But yeah, you see there, this is a lot of, and we didn't talk a lot about cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch. These are very influential folks in my way of thinking, but ways in which we, again, to think about I'd say a new form. We talked about kind of the mind as being a conduit for or connected to our soul, and a conduit for kind of spirituality or spiritual kind of connection. We talked about the mind and the brain as being a kind of material entity that can be intervened on either with surgery or electricity. But increasingly, we're thinking about the mind and the brain as information processors. And that gets into, well, could you affect the mind and the brain through information? Do you really need to zap someone's brain to change how they're thinking? And I think the answer is no. And we talked about that a little bit earlier with just good books, but we're seeing that even now with all a lot of different ways. But the cyberneticists, Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch, and many others, um, were onto that because they were then thinking about, well, how do computers work? How do they process information? How is that like our human mind? Yeah, just there's so many books, Timothy. Yeah, just but that's an example there. Yeah, here's a really good set, History of Magic and Experimental Science by Thorndike. That's actually I think it's an 8-volume set, all written by one man, which is extraordinary to think about. That one person had all of that information in their mind, but that's a really important set because it shows that what we think of as science really evolved from alchemy, which evolved out of kind of folk, thinking. And so, you think about it, science is distinct from other things, but actually magic and alchemy blend into chemistry, which is, I'm sure your father was very familiar with some of these concepts, right? And then next to that is a 2-volume set. That's the works of Hippocrates in Greek and Latin. I think that's the oldest set I have in the collection. It's probably 1600s. Herbert Spencer, psychology. There's the Dialogues of Plato. That's a classic late 19th century kind of Jowett translation. Yeah, so just some key kind of foundational books there. Yeah, you see there, hard to read again, and we don't need to go through in detail, but yeah, there you see Mysterium Magnum, BAME, again, mysticism, but also Christian. Just to the left of that, the Thrice Greatest Hermes. So that's an area that I'm just becoming more familiar with, Hermetic thinking. That's the translation from Mead. I think this is a reprint from the 60s, but consistent with his original translation, I think from the 19th century. I think it's GRS Mead, I believe. Gregory Bateson next to him, Navin. Bateson is a very important thinker. He's important. He was married to Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. They co-wrote some books together. He also then got deeply involved with the cyberneticists. So he bridged anthropology with cybernetic thinking about the brain. And so he's a really important mid 20th century thinker. And then there's a couple of other books there. You see Richard Hunter and Ida McAlpine. We were talking about that mother and son duo. Those are a couple of other really important translations or reproductions. These were books from the early 19th century that had deep impact on the field of psychiatry, and they republished those just as they did with the Schreiber book. And that was a whole series. And then if you go, there's Schreber, which I pulled off the shelf for you. And then you go further, those 4 volumes there are interesting. Those are all Michel Foucault. And again, we didn't talk about Foucault, who had very important things to say. He's a kind of a postmodernist, deeply influential on current thinking about the way in which power is used. And because he was writing in that period of time, again, think post lobotomy, post Delgado, think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but he's writing from a very different tradition. He's writing from a French tradition, philosophical tradition, but having similar conclusions about the way in which power is used. And we didn't talk about Thomas Zaz, who's probably above that. If you go up to the upper shelves there, yeah, there you go. The Manufacture of Madness, kind of the American version of Zaz to some degree. They had ultimately very different kind of worldviews and perspectives, but and ultimately slightly different conclusions. But Zaz, and you see the Myth of Mental Illness there on the far left. Those are probably his 2 most important books. The Myth of Mental Illness there, 1960. And essentially what he was saying in that book, again, the 2-second summary is that these labels, the nosology that I mentioned before, it's all made up. It's all just people sitting around a table coming up with labels. And so they're human-made constructions. They're not real. And so he didn't think that patients who are suffering were faking it. That's not what he was thinking. So it's not a myth in that sense. It was a myth in the sense that these labels are just made up labels, and he didn't really believe in them.
And I forget if he's connected to it, but the whole, I think in the Soviet, some of those countries where political resistance was classified as a disorder.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. But again, it's important to remember, and this is also interesting as I think about eugenics, which we didn't talk about either, but that's a whole nother angle. These concepts, while we think about Soviet abuses of psychiatry as being important, Saz would have said yes, and we're doing some of that here. I showed you Freeman, for example, or, Delgado or others, we didn't talk about Heath. Heath is another this book.
The Goldwater Rule.
This is Tulane Department of Psychiatry. This is Heath talking about, again, he used Robert G. Heath, stimulation on the brain, trying to cure people with schizophrenia, but very controversial. So Zaz would say yes, Soviet psychiatry. They had not thinking of the name of it now, but they had a label which they called
Sluggish schizophrenia.
What's that?
Sluggish schizophrenia.
That's it. That's exactly it, Timothy. Yeah. So that was their big label. But Zaz would say, well, we have our own labels. So that's I think trying to summarize what he was about. Yeah, and that's more fiction. So again, I in the same room, I try to keep fiction, and then some of it is admixture. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's fiction, what's not fiction, and I think that's what's fascinating. There's a Synthojoy is a good one. That's D.G. Compton. Remember, I showed you this book by D.G. Compton. Synthojoy is another very good one. That's a book about putting in stimulators in your brain. In this case, I think it was a husband who had a stimulator implanted in his wife's brain so that she could experience joy. It was tapping into those circuits in the brain that are essentially joy circuits, which came right out of actual neuroscience, where rats would stimulate their brains to get treats, over and over again to the point of exhaustion. That's not exactly what Compton's writing about here, and he's doing it in a very nuanced way, but that's one example. Yeah, and at some point, again, if you want me to, I can come back and we can talk a little bit more about some of the fiction there and the way narratives about the mind, narratives about society have been used, I mean, forever, but some of those are really important here in thinking about the brain and the mind. Yeah, this is just outside the kind of inner sanctum area. There's a little phrenology head. Yeah. That's Fowler's phrenology head. That's a little mini one, using it there as a bookend. Noema's a kind of a modern publication that they're doing some really nice things.
What's the subject matter?
It's in this general area. I'd say I don't know what their tagline is, but they do. I think it's maybe based out of Silicon Valley, so they tend to have a lot of interest in technology, but technology, the mind, society, um, kind of sweet spot for me. Books on books there. Auction catalogs. I collect a lot of auction catalogs. I think those are useful to see how other collectors have built their libraries. I kind of enjoy reading about, people who have pulled together, thoughtful collections of books and how they've gone about that. It's just a sliver of some of the records I have. That's a cool set there, that Phaedon set. I think that's Phaedon, their art publisher. That is 1,000 essentially tools that humans have created, and talks about the objects, the actual objects, like a can open. I don't know if it's in there, but as an example, like a can opener, um, and how beautiful it is, and how useful it is, and how humans have created these tools over time. So I like that. I like that series. There's some thinking about the extended mind. Clark and Chalmers are the philosophers, and essentially what they're talking about in 1998, a very simple paper, is that we extend our mind outside of our brains to our tools. Um, so, for example, if I'm losing my memory and I write something down on a sticky pad, right? That's a tool now. That's a tool that is actually an extension of my own mind. But the can opener is a way in which we extend our thinking and preserve it in a tool that we can then pass along through generations. And I think it's Leroy Dunham. I'm blanking on his name. He's like an important anthropologic thinker in this space. A number of other people have thought about the fact that since we can be upright, it freed up our hands, so that we didn't have to walk on the ground, right? And so it freed up our hands to use tools, and that was a major development in the progression of humankind.
Andre Leroy Gorham.
Gorhan, yeah, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think he's the thinker that's I often associate with kind of tool use.
Affordances. I think that might be connected. But
I'm sorry, I didn't.
the word affordances.
Affordances, yeah, I think that was his concept. And I'd be curious, just to go back one slide there. I have pulp magazines. These are classic magazines. I didn't show any of them today, and you can see those are records. But if you go to the right, um, yeah, those are graded pulps. And so you can send these pulp magazines out for grading now. So I've started to play with that. I'd be interested in whether your readership has been doing that at all, um, either for magazines or for, in this case, pulps. What I've done that for would be for ones that are like in very strong condition, that have iconic covers, and I actually like how they look. Again, I could, you know, if you're interested, come back and show you some pulp magazines. These are essentially ways in which science fiction was presented to the public. I mean, this is the way in which they were communicated. So all of Philip K. Dick, a lot of these J.G. Ballard, like the great, what I think of as the great fiction writers of the kind of later 20th century, they all started writing. Even L. Ron Hubbard, who we didn't talk about, but the creator founder of Scientology, his work started in pulps. He wrote Dianetics. I think it was 1950 51. That was in I think it was in Astounding Science Fiction. Um, so these pulps are really important, and I'm trying to capture some of that and have them graded where I can.
I did a bookshelf tour with Vintage SF. Um, we can put a link to that down below.
Awesome.
And he has that collection of the masterworks, and he told a bunch of the history uh, of exactly what you're talking about, the early days of the magazine, and then how that turned into paperbacks and all the way to the modern day.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. I'll take another look at that video because I think it's a really important history for how this information was communicated out to the public. And then, yeah, so this is now in my office at work. So you can see actually I pulled that Larchet set, which is at the very bottom there, um, in the far corner. That's that 3-volume set there. And then right next to it is the mind training book. So I pulled those in from the office just to show you here. And then other books, books on these are actual books I use, for clinical care. Some books on visual display of information there. Yeah, comprehensive textbooks, other books on psychiatry, some history as I write on different topics.
The baby blue book set up top looks interesting.
Yeah, that's Cambridge. That's the Cambridge set. History of English literature, very, very dense. So that's not here's 2 pages on Shakespeare, or something like that. This is really thoughtful essays on different sub genres of English literature throughout, I'd say, over probably 1,000+ year history of literature. So I came across that one time. I don't even remember where I found that, but I found it in cleaned them up and got them covered up, and it's a nice set. And,
So why do you have those at work?
I don't know. It's a good question, Timothy. I mean, but your question is actually more relevant because I end up shuttling things back and forth. And so this idea of what's the working library, what's inner sanctum, what do I write in, what do I not write in, it's becoming more blurred over time. But yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I should probably have those here at home.
What are these right here?
Those are books on philosophy. That was a set, actually a pretty important set that was released in, I'm sorry, the picture got cut off. Maybe there's another picture. If you show the front facing picture, you can see it, maybe in more detail. But those are, I'd say, late 1960s. Daniel Dennett was in there, and I think some of his early pieces. And those are published both. Yeah, you can see the publishers both in the UK, Routledge and Keegan Paul, and then Humanities Press here in the United States. And so I have a couple that are, I guess, US printing, and a couple that are UK. But they were also publishing on, I'd say, the overlap of philosophy and brain science, philosophy and cybernetics. And so that's why I have some of those. And those books, those black books that you saw down there, those are from Santa Fe Institute. And they're publishing some really important stuff on complexity science and how it links in with things like economics. I mean, essentially any field that your viewers might be interested in, whether they're interested in the environment, in economics, certainly in social political affairs, and then in the brain and mind. And so I find anything that they put out, I look at, and I'm starting to pull some of that into my collection.
There's some interesting hieroglyphics here.
They have their own little system, and you have to go into the book to figure out, what those mean. But yeah, if you knew their hieroglyphic system, you could understand what those books are. And you can see that one of them is on economics. The first two are on economics, so those have their own categorization hieroglyphics. And then I think that next one, there's maybe something on computing or something like that. Entropy and physics of energy are on the far end, so those have a little bit of a different hieroglyphic system.
Okay, so we'll come back to those another time.
Yeah, just some things on the desk there on the table. Yeah, I've become very interested. I shared with you a couple of record albums. I've become very interested in the way in which music has been electronified, AI'd, I guess you could say that. But the idea that AI is making music now that's not a new thing. And what we've seen is a gradual shift in the concept of music, understanding music as information. Music concrete is maybe a group, or Pierre Schaeffer is a major writer, thinker. The bottom one there is Leonard Bernstein. That's about music. The Dover, I think from a lot of your videos, you see a lot of that Dover series. They've published a lot on physics, maybe on math, right? This is one on music, on information, hearing in this case.
The bookshelf tour with the PhD from Harvard in biochemistry had a lot of Dover in his collection.
They're good. I don't know if they were released in hardback, but I've only seen them in paperback, and they're solid. I mean, and a lot of it is very enduring information, released, in a way that, even a non-physicist, non-mathematician can typically understand. So I certainly appreciate that.
There's your cup holder.
Cup holder, yeah. Yep. That's my home base. And yeah, this is just another shelf at the office. Again, thinking about, there's some good history books there. And a lot more books on ethics. I'm a member of the faculty at the Center for Bioethics at Harvard, and so thinking about ethics and the way in which we frame that historically from the ancient Greeks to modern day, I find fascinating. Yeah, Battle for Your Brain is a good one. Nita Farahani, she's at Duke now. That's a modern book. See that on the left there. That's an important book. She's an important thinker. Thinking about it again, the way in which information is being used. She's an attorney by training. So that's a good one. The shorter book, if you wanted a kind of basic history of psychiatry, that's a good one. That's a good solid history of psychiatry. I think that was published maybe about 20 years ago or so.
The shorter.
But I'd say, yeah, I think it might be Edward Shorter. Um, Yeah, some books on again the far shelf. There's you see the Nazi doctors, Robert J. Lifton, transcripts from the Nuremberg trials, all extremely important in the history of medical ethics. Um, Bernard Stiegler, probably a thinker I should mention. He's been deeply influential on me. Sadly, he died just a few years ago, but Age of Disruption there. His big work, which we didn't really talk about, is Techniques in Time. That's a 3-volume work, but he was very important. He actually was where I learned about the Pharmakon. He was deeply interested in this idea that information is and the way in which we use technology can be both extremely beneficial and extremely detrimental. And then a lot of books on there's that you've probably seen that set before. I can't remember the author. I think it's Kenny. Might be Timothy Kenny. I might be getting that wrong. Um, Ancient Philosophy, Medieval Philosophy. That's a 4-volume set there, Oxford. And a lot of books on medical safety, patient safety. And then some books on the bottom there, Oliver Sacks. He was deeply influential in my thinking, a very thoughtful writer. But interestingly, we talked about fiction, nonfiction before. It's recently come to light that some of the narratives that he was telling about patients may have been fictionalized in some way. And so it's caused me to really grapple with, well, is that okay? What do I think about that? How do we think about patient stories to begin with? But Oliver Sacks is a really good writer. He wrote The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He wrote the book Awakenings, which got made into a movie with Robin Williams playing Oliver Sacks in the movie. And then those are books that I wrote chapters in, so I have some copies of some of those and other books that have just been very important to me. Yeah, so I hope that gives just a general overview. Again, we didn't do a deep library tour, but just give you a sense of some of the books that have influenced me. Oh yeah, and these are modern, these are classics. They're akin to like the Easton Press books that you might see. Um, and these are leather bound. They're very well made, but they're all reproductions. So to some degree, they're they're very good translations or reproductions, so that if you want to read like Charcot, for example, who we didn't talk about, it's a great way to read him, but they're not necessarily collectible in and of themselves, or maybe I shouldn't say that in that way, but they kind of fall in this in between world where they're nice enough that I don't feel comfortable writing in them, but they're not in and of themselves, I'd say, extraordinarily valuable. I'll put it that way, even though they look pretty nice on the shelf. And these were released. I think they've probably stopped now, but they in the late 80s, early 90s, they released a lot of books, classics of library of medicine, in neurology, in pretty much every field of medicine. And I think the market was physicians with a little extra money who wanted to buy nice looking books for the shelf. But so
What about
there
your
you go.
bag here?
Yeah, that's mine. That's from medical school. That's the actual doctor's bag. I don't really use it now when I go see patients, but more of an affectation at some level.
And then the final item is the Oxford English Dictionary.
Oh yeah, I just got this recently. Yeah, and these are books on books, a little bit of history of the field. These are books that help me to think about my collection, but then yeah, the OED. I'm thrilled to have that in the collection because when you think about models of the world, a lot of it comes back to language and how language captures our world. You know, when we even say like this is what is this? This is a book. You know, we have shortcuts so that I can show you this and say I've got a book and you know what I'm talking about. Well, there's I think 12 volumes plus a supplement on all the ways in which we use the English language to capture the world and our place in it.
So you gave us the book recommendation, but there was also the idea of if there's any current areas of interest where you might want members of the audience to comment on book recommendations. If you have any thoughts on that, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm every day essentially I'm surfing, we're going through shops, looking on eBay, I'm trying to learn myself every day, like learning, and I'm sure you're the same, Timothy, just knowing you just a little bit. It's that hunger for what else is out there, and that's the incredible thing is it's infinite. It literally is infinite. So I guess if one area would be maybe Eastern models for thinking, like the Vedic models or Hindu models, maybe Taoist models, Confucianist model. I really don't have a good sense of that space. I saw one of your guests had, what was it, the Eastern his history of Eastern thought or something that's an extraordinarily expensive set, published, I think, out of Oxford. Maybe the originals were late 19th century. But whether there's a good set or a good kind of way to capture that, I'd be very interested in that. Because
Called the
that's definitely
Sacred
a weak
Books of the
spot.
East.
Yeah, that's the set. That's the set. Yeah, and that looks extraordinarily strong, but also scarce and very expensive. Now, I think those got reprinted, and I think there may have been printings out of India using India paper, so very thin paper. But I don't know. I don't know the detail on that.
Yeah, I'm also interested in that area and the idea of culturally bound syndromes. Um, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So I'm really looking forward to returning for a round two, and people can let us
I would
know in
love
the
it. Yeah.
comments what subjects, what types of books they might be particularly interested in, and any questions they may have for you. So definitely leave those down in the comments. And thanks again, Anthony, for sharing your books with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much, Timothy. Appreciate it.